Nevertheless, she persisted. Jesus calls the woman in this parable persistent. She had been delivered an injustice, and she was not willing to give up. She was strong, she was determined, she was courageous, she refused to be silent. We can imagine what people would be saying in the crowd around her as Jesus told this story. Why doesn't she just fill out the paperwork like everyone else and leave it at the office? Why does she think that she's so special? Why is she rocking the boat? Doesn't she know the rules? That woman is like a dog with a bone and won't let it go. And there are other words that were probably used to describe this strong woman's behavior. You've heard them before. I can't use them in church. You know the words that are used against women to demean, to belittle, and to humiliate. In Jesus' day, widows were the most vulnerable among them, vulnerable to poverty and exploitation. It was challenging enough to be a woman, but to be a widow or to not have a man care for you puts you in a really precarious situation. Justice for the widow was required by the law, but as many of us know, just because there's a law doesn't mean that people follow the law. She stands before a judge who we assume knows the law, but is described as someone who does not fear God nor respects people. The law seemed to matter little to this judge, and yet he had power over the rich and influential. Why would he even bother to listen to this widow? Is this not an age-old story? The powerful, looking with disdain, caring little for the justice of this one person, this one who can be marginalized, ignored, sidelined, silenced. Who cares? The word in Hebrew for a widow actually means silent one, or one unable to speak. For the past few weeks, we've been hearing and reflecting on stories of Jesus where he has lifted up people from the margins and given them a voice, and in some cases has made them the heroes or the heroines of the story. When we come to this story today, we find that the silent one not only finds her voice, but she takes initiative to speak up for herself, for justice. She's not afraid to tell her story or speak her truth, even to a man, even to the judge. She will not be a victim. I don't know how many of you have been to the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. I got there for the first time on Monday, and it is really a powerful experience to walk through that museum and see the history of what has happened in our country. Many of these stories we learned in school, but there's many stories that we never learned. Those stories were silenced or marginalized. But there you walk through this exhibit after exhibit after exhibit, and you hear these voices of Martin Luther King Jr. or Sojourner Truth or Harriet Tubman, John Lewis, and of course Elijah Cummings, who we have just lost this week. Display after display in that museum is about persistence and not giving up and not willing to accept injustice. But the most powerful part for me was seeing these older African Americans with their family members and friends looking at these photos of the lynchings, of the Jim Crow days, of the whites-only water fountains, the drawings of those bodies lying side by side in the hulls of the ships coming over during the height of slavery. It was incredible to see their faces as they looked at these horrible pictures, but also to see how their story, their lives were validated. Here in this museum, they can see that someone has listened. Someone is paying attention. And you can see about the struggle that continues to go on. You can see that we are still not done with this struggle for justice for all. And there we see, in this museum, people who stood up for what they believed was right, refused to believe that they were anything other than a beloved child of God, refused to give up nevertheless, and stood in front of guns and hoses and dogs and mobs and corrupt police officers, but they persisted. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Change does not roll on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle." And that faith is taking the first step, even when you don't know the whole staircase. This year also marks the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote. I didn't get a chance to go to that exhibit, National Archives, so I'm going to put it out there. Some of us have family members. My Nana Kirshner was one of the people who was able to vote for the first time 100 years ago. She was a very quiet person, but when I had a chance to ruffle through her books, she had a number of books that were from suffragists, and I still have some of them. She never said much about it except that she was proud to be able to vote in that election 100 years ago. But I was imagining in this 100th anniversary year, all the marches, all the rallies, all the letters that were written by women in order to get that right to vote. How many of those women stood in front of the seats of power and spoke their truth over and over and over again? Imagine what names they were called and how they were attempts to silence them. Imagine the harassment. Imagine. And yet they persisted. These are days when we may feel like the widow in Jesus' story, wondering if anyone hears our words, wondering whether it makes a difference to write that letter or march in Washington, D.C., or speak up in front of Congress or anywhere else in the halls of power. These are days when we may feel like that widow, that we're standing before people like that judge who doesn't seem to care about God and has no regard for people. Jesus told this story so that the disciples and us would not grow weary, to keep on praying, but also to keep on doing those necessary actions for justice, to keep on working for a day when all people will be noticed and named and honored, in praying to remember that we are connected to God as a source of power and we are connected to God's people. I know many of us feel tired and weary, and I know that many of us are persisting in so many different areas of life today to bring about light and hope and justice. But let's look back and give thanks for those who persisted so that we can be where we are today. The African American History Museum shows that change can happen, that change has happened, that change is happening, but it is still a struggle and we still need to persist. I'm grateful for the women who persisted and made it possible for women like me to have a voice, but also to remind us that we are all beloved children of God and could be gifted for ministry. I'm grateful for my time at Catawba College as a student and as an alum, for the ways in which that educational program encouraged me to find my voice. My mother will tell you I was never a silent one, but that education gave me a chance to find a renewed way of saying what I needed to say and to be the person that God has called me to be. I refuse to be silent or put anyone back in the closet around LGBTQ issues because they think any of us are being too vocal and they wish we would go away. I refuse to be silent when we know that children are being held in cages on our border and we're separating families. ERUCC, you have chosen to speak on behalf of God's creation, that we can make a difference. Is it messy to separate our trash and do composting? You bet. But it's the right thing to do. ERUCC, you have stood on these steps time and time again in concern for safe gun control, for immigration, for LGBTQ plus rights. We have stood on those steps because we know that our voice makes a difference. Jesus tells his story so we don't grow weary and to give up, and to remind ourselves of who may be silenced in the world today. Who are those who are finding themselves standing before the powers? And what can we do to stand with them? We know from the persistent work of people of faith and others that the world does not need to be this way. Jesus holds up the faith and the persistence of this woman. She is our model for today. She's the one that reminds us to stand with her and all who have been a voice of justice and face the powers that be to keep us silent. I hope that we will not grow weary of praying. I hope and pray that we don't grow weary of our work. I hope that we remember to stay close to God and to one another, because God has some work for us to do. Thanks be to God. Amen.